The first thing I noticed was that my neighbor, Laurel Whitmore, was crying before she even opened the passenger door. The second thing I noticed was that she was holding a small velvet box so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. I had no idea that by the end of that afternoon, the movie I had invited her to watch would become the least important thing either of us remembered. Laurel and I had lived beside each other for almost 3 years, yet until that day, we had never been friends. We were the kind of neighbors who nodded politely across the driveway, collected each other's packages when necessary, and knew just enough about one another to avoid asking difficult questions. I knew she had lost someone important. I knew she rarely had visitors. I knew she spent most mornings sitting on her front porch with a cup of coffee that often went cold before she drank it. But I didn't know why. I didn't know what was inside that velvet box. And I certainly didn't know why, after I drove her to the old drive-in theater on the edge of town, she would suddenly climb into the back seat, sit beside me, and whisper with trembling eyes, "The movie can wait." Before I tell you what happened next, if you believe that kindness can change a life, that forgiveness can heal wounds we cannot see, and that everyone deserves hope and a second chance, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment, share this story with someone who needs encouragement today, and subscribe to our channel. Sometimes the smallest act of kindness becomes the beginning of someone's greatest rescue. My name is Everett Calloway, and at 46, I had become surprisingly comfortable with silence. I lived alone in a modest house at the end of a quiet suburban street, worked from home repairing architectural drawings for construction companies, and had developed a habit of filling my afternoons with small tasks that gave me an excuse not to think about the things I had lost. My marriage had ended 4 years earlier, not because of some dramatic betrayal, but because two people who once loved each other had slowly become strangers. There was no villain, no explosive final argument, just years of disappointment that eventually became heavier than love. After the divorce, I stopped making plans. I stopped expecting good things. I told myself I was peaceful, but the truth was that I was hiding. Laurel lived in the blue-gray house next door. She was probably in her early 40s, though grief had given her face a tiredness that made guessing her age difficult. She worked part-time at a local library and spent the rest of her time caring for her father, who had suffered a stroke the previous year. Her father, Martin, rarely left the house. Sometimes I would see Laurel struggling to carry groceries while keeping an eye on him through the front window. Once, during a heavy rainstorm, I noticed her standing outside in the driveway with a broken umbrella while trying to lift a wheelchair into her car. I helped without asking questions. She thanked me quietly. That was the longest conversation we'd ever had. The idea of taking her to the drive-in came from something completely ordinary. One Saturday morning, while checking my mailbox, I found a flyer announcing that the old Riverside Drive-In had reopened for a special daytime classic movie event. The theater had been closed for years, but the new owners had restored the giant screen and were showing old films every weekend. I had always loved movies, especially the ones that reminded me of a simpler time. As I stood there reading the flyer, I saw Laurel walking toward her house with a paper bag of groceries. She looked exhausted. On impulse, I asked if she would like to come with me that afternoon. She stopped as though I had asked something much bigger. For several seconds she said nothing. Then she smiled faintly and accepted. I almost regretted asking because I knew she rarely went anywhere unless her father needed something. But she arranged for a home care worker to stay with him for a few hours, and that afternoon she appeared at my driveway wearing a simple cream sweater and carrying the little velvet box I hadn't seen before. The drive to the theater took only 20 minutes, but Laurel barely spoke. She stared through the passenger window at the passing houses and farms, occasionally rubbing her thumb over the edge of the velvet box. I didn't press her. I had learned that some silences were invitations and others were boundaries. When we arrived, the theater was busier than I expected. Families sat in lawn chairs beside their cars. Children carried popcorn beneath the bright afternoon sun. Couples laughed beside old pickup trucks, and the enormous movie screen stood against a clear blue sky. It felt strangely nostalgic, even though the film had not started yet. We parked near the back, bought popcorn and drinks, and settled into my old sedan. Laurel smiled when the previews began. For the first time since I had known her, she looked genuinely relaxed. Then the screen went dark for a technical adjustment, and Laurel suddenly looked at the velvet box again. Her smile disappeared. She opened it. Inside was a small silver key attached to a faded red ribbon. I asked what it opened, and she stared at it for so long that I thought she hadn't heard me. Finally, she told me it belonged to her younger brother, Graham. I had never heard his name. She explained that Graham had died 2 years earlier after years of struggling with addiction. The words came slowly, painfully, as if she had to pull each one from somewhere deep inside herself. Graham had stolen money from their parents. He had lied repeatedly. He had disappeared for months at a time. He had promised to change and broken those promises so many times that Laurel eventually stopped believing him. The final argument between them had happened 3 days before his death. She had refused to answer his call because she was angry. He left a voicemail she never listened to until after the funeral. She had carried the unopened voicemail on an old phone for 2 years, unable to delete it and unable to hear it. Then she told me why she had asked me to bring her there. Graham had taken her to that same drive-in when they were teenagers. They had sat in the back seat of their parents' station wagon, sharing popcorn and laughing at a terrible science fiction movie. It was one of the last memories she had of him before his addiction changed everything. She wanted to sit there once more, in a place where she could remember her brother before she remembered the pain. I listened without interrupting. Then she said something that broke through the emotional distance I had carefully built around myself. She said she wasn't sure whether she missed Graham or the person she wished he had become. I told her I understood that feeling more than I wanted to admit. I had spent 4 years grieving a marriage that had technically ended while both people were still alive. Sometimes, I explained, we don't mourn people. We mourn the future we thought we were going to have with them. The movie started, but neither of us watched it. Laurel kept staring at the screen while tears quietly rolled down her cheeks. Then her phone vibrated. She looked at it and froze. It was a message from the home care worker saying that Martin had become upset and was asking for her. Laurel immediately reached for the door handle. I told her I'd drive her home, but she shook her head and said she didn't want to ruin my afternoon. That sentence hit me harder than it should have. She wasn't worried about her own feelings. She was worried about inconveniencing someone else. She apologized for crying. She apologized for receiving the invitation. She apologized for needing to leave. She had spent so long believing that her pain was a burden that she had forgotten she was allowed to have it. As we pulled out of the theater, she suddenly asked me to stop. I pulled into an empty roadside parking area beneath the bright afternoon sky. Laurel looked at me with an expression I couldn't understand. Then she unfastened her seatbelt, climbed into the back seat, and sat down beside the old blanket I kept there. She held the velvet box against her chest. I turned around, startled. She wiped her eyes and whispered, "The movie can wait." She wasn't talking about romance. She wasn't making some secret confession. She simply wanted to sit in the back seat where she and Graham had once sat, even if it was a different car, a different day, and a different version of herself. She asked me to sit beside her. So I did. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then Laurel finally opened the old phone she had been carrying in her purse. Her hands shook so badly that she almost dropped it. She had kept Graham's final voicemail saved for 2 years. She pressed play. His voice was tired, embarrassed, and frightened. He didn't ask for money. He didn't make excuses. He simply said he was sorry. He said he didn't know how to fix everything, but he wanted to try. He told Laurel that he remembered the drive-in and the way she used to laugh at bad movies. Then he said he hoped one day she would remember him without being angry. When the message ended, Laurel broke down. She wasn't crying because Graham had died. She was crying because she had finally heard the words she had spent 2 years fearing. I sat beside her while she cried, and for the first time in years, I stopped trying to fix someone else's pain. I simply stayed. That was all she needed. After a while, she told me she had blamed herself for Graham's death because she believed that if she had answered that final call, everything might have been different. I told her that loving someone doesn't give us control over their choices. We can offer help, forgiveness, patience, and compassion, but we cannot live another person's life for them. Laurel looked at me and said she had never allowed herself to believe that. She had spent 2 years punishing herself for a decision she made while exhausted, frightened, and hurt. When we finally drove back toward town, something between us had changed. Laurel wasn't suddenly healed. I wasn't suddenly wise. But we were no longer strangers. She asked about my divorce, and I told her the truth. I had spent years blaming myself because I believed I had failed my marriage. I had convinced myself that if I had worked harder, spoken more gently, or sacrificed more, maybe my former wife would have stayed. Laurel listened and told me something I would remember for the rest of my life. She said forgiveness wasn't always about forgiving another person. Sometimes it meant releasing yourself from a punishment you had carried long after the sentence had ended. That afternoon became the beginning of an unexpected friendship. I began helping Laurel with small things around the house, never treating her like someone who needed rescuing. She helped me rediscover the simple pleasure of having someone to share lunch with, someone to call when something funny happened, someone who understood that silence could be comforting when shared with the right person. Martin eventually recovered enough to spend more time outside, and I began seeing him sitting on the porch beside Laurel. One Saturday, Laurel invited me over for lunch. She placed the velvet box on the table, but this time she wasn't holding it like something painful. She had placed Graham's key inside a small glass frame along with a photograph of the two of them as teenagers at the drive-in. She said she had decided to stop hiding the memory. She couldn't change what happened, but she could choose what the memory meant. Months later, Laurel volunteered at a community center that helped families dealing with addiction and grief. She told me she wanted to become for someone else what she had needed when Graham was struggling, a person who could listen without judging. I started volunteering there too. Neither of us called it a transformation. We simply showed up. We discovered that healing was rarely dramatic. It looked like answering a phone call. Sitting beside someone in silence. Making lunch. Saying you're sorry. Accepting an apology. Letting yourself laugh after months of believing laughter was disrespectful to the dead. Sometimes healing looked like getting into the back seat of an old car under a bright afternoon sky and finally allowing yourself to remember someone you loved without letting the worst thing they ever did erase everything good about them. A year after that first drive-in afternoon, we returned to Riverside. The theater was holding another daytime classic movie event. Laurel brought the same photograph, but not the velvet box. She had given the key to Martin, who kept it on a shelf beside Graham's picture. We parked in almost the same place as before. The sun was warm, children were running across the grass, and the giant screen stood against a brilliant blue sky. Laurel looked at me and smiled. She said she had once believed the best part of her life was behind her. Now she understood that grief could become part of a person's story without becoming the whole story. As the movie began, Laurel reached for the popcorn and laughed at something on the screen. I watched her for a moment and realized that the woman who had once apologized for crying was now laughing without hesitation. I thought about the first day we met, the woman sitting alone on her porch, and the man I had been when I invited her to that movie simply because I thought she looked lonely. Neither of us knew what we were doing that day. We thought we were going to watch a film. Instead, we gave each other something neither of us knew we needed, permission to begin again. Before the credits rolled, Laurel leaned back in her seat and closed her eyes for a moment. She looked peaceful. Not perfectly healed. Not free from memories. Just peaceful. And I understood something I wish I had learned much earlier. Sometimes kindness doesn't arrive with grand speeches or heroic gestures. Sometimes it is simply an invitation. A seat in a car. A person willing to listen. A hand that doesn't let go when the tears begin. A reminder that your worst day does not have to become your whole life. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, leave a meaningful comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey. And before you go, leave a meaningful comment telling us what forgiveness means to you, or tell us about a small act of kindness that changed your life. Because you never know when one simple invitation, one quiet conversation, or one moment of compassion might become the reason someone chooses hope again. Laurel went to the drive-in that afternoon thinking she was there to remember the brother she had lost. I went thinking I was simply taking a lonely neighbor to a movie. Neither of us expected that the movie would wait, because the real story was happening in the back seat, where two wounded people finally stopped running from their past and gave themselves permission to believe that the best parts of their lives might still be ahead.